Hello everyone, this is Bart Wijstra from FHIR. I am moderating this session for Hugh Glover. Welcome very much to the FHIR Resources for Clinical Research, and there is no one better to talk on this topic than Hugh, because he is both one half of Blue Wave Informatics, but mostly he's the co-chair of the HL7 Biomedical Research and Regulations Working Group and the technical director of the Vulcan Accelerator. Hugh has mentioned that he would like to have the questions when they come in, so I'll try to interrupt whenever you have questions. Please put them in the Q&A and I'll try to ask them if relevant. Otherwise, you will get back to them later. Thank you very much, Hugh. Over to you.
Thank you, Ward. Get my screen running. And hopefully you can see all that now and we're all up and running. So thank you for the introduction. So as Ward said, I'm technical director for Vulcan. I've been kicking around HL7 for something like 20 years. Originally on the pharmacy side, but for the last 10 years or so, I've been predominantly involved in the clinical research side of things, and took on a role within the Vulcan Accelerator about this time last year. So I've done a number of these talks around clinical research and how that works with FHIR. What I want to do today is to talk a little bit about Vulcan, but actually not a huge amount, but to look at some of the resources that we use in clinical research, and particularly some of the changes that we've been making to those resources within the BR&R work group. So the sorts of questions that we've had people puzzling over on a regular basis are the ones that are in the list here. So how do we represent recruitment and eligibility? How do you represent a set of study visits? What was the difference between a study subject and a patient? How do we know about consent? All these are things which in themselves, none of them are terribly difficult, but there are multiple different ways in which you might tackle them. And we've really suffered by not providing a good set of examples that people can come along and take a look at. So as part of the overall Vulcan effort, we've been able to start funding some work that's really starting to produce some examples and talk through that. And this really is the beginning of that sequence of things. So what is Vulcan? I am not going to dwell on this at length, but Vulcan started up in 2019 at a September working group meeting. A set of like-minded people coming together who wanted to make more progress in clinical research. We got derailed a bit by the pandemic like everybody else. Really started working properly in about September of last year. Did our first Connectathon in January, second Connectathon in May, and there's a sequence of Connectathons, I think, coming down the pipe towards us for the next few years. Membership of Vulcan is across the board. So it comes from the pharmaceutical suppliers and the translational products and the biopharmaceuticals. It comes from the regulators. It comes from system vendors. It comes from the clinical research organizations, from academic medical centers, some universities, and some of the government-funded research groups. The bulk of the membership that you can see here has a US flavor to it, but there's no actual sense in which Vulcan is a US-focused organization. It's just where we started up and what we set out to do. And it tended to pick up an initial group of US members, hence the US focus, but we shall be moving outside the US. Vulcan's a FHIR Accelerator. There's half a dozen of those now. I'm sure this group knows what they're there for. The things that Vulcan was particularly trying to do was fill gaps. So gaps between clinical care and clinical research. The systems that run in the two areas often do very similar tasks, but actually do them in different ways and end up with separate sets of results, which really should be the same sets of results. So trying to bring those together, trying to join in the gaps between different sets of people working on things at the same time, and through that fill in some of the gaps in physical resources of people working on stuff, and fill in some of the gaps in tooling and education. So all of that is Vulcan trying to enable our research area to work more effectively than it does at the moment. Vulcan's not really about trying to take over projects and start doing new things. We've got 3 projects that we've been running with to start with: real world data for FDA submissions on regulated products. We've been looking at schedule of activities and how we represent that. We've been looking at FHIR packets and how you get those into the EHR. And those have all been through the classic style of project work, building applications, building into implementation guides, running things through Connectathons. But we recently started a new piece of work, which is the roundtables, trying to bring groups together to identify the gaps and really say, what can Vulcan do for you? And through those produce a series of landscape maps, which just help people navigate what's going on in all these different areas. And I think it will really show up when we start to bring in some of the European work and the Asia Pacific work and overlay that on what's already going on in the US. And we start to see where we've got duplication and a lack of reuse of some of the things that we ought to be able to reuse. Most of the FHIR education that you can go out and get is focused on health generally, so clinical care. There's very little of it that's actually focused on the research side of things. FHIR itself doesn't really change, but the examples that people use, the context in which it's described can be different. So we want to start running some new courses that will be much like the old courses, but with more of a clinical research focus. And the research, subject research study resources that have been around really for a long time now within FHIR, Vulcan is trying to enable those resources to develop at a more rapid rate than they have done. They've been stuck on a low level of maturity for rather a long time. We also have a responsibility, I think, to provide some physical resource. We will need to provide a Vulcan server for testing, particularly where we're starting to use some of the very recent stuff that goes into R5 or even in current build things, and we need to be able to try it out. But also to have good data sets for testing things. The ordinary clinical care data sets tend not to cover all the things that we need to cover and look at. So if this is a domain that you're not familiar with, I went through in the Connectathon this time last year a dummy clinical trial and what actually goes on, and the next 2 slides are taken from that. I'm not going to run them at full length at all. If you need to spend some time with those, go back and find the presentation from them and start at about 19 minutes. And these slides get walked through in a lot more detail. But essentially a clinical trial runs in multiple different countries. It has a target number of sites and a target number of subjects, but the actual number you achieve for both is always a bit different from what you start off with. You then have to decide whether or not you've got suitable subjects. So there's some exclusion of some of them because they don't meet your criteria. You have to have processes for supplying your study medication. Then you've got to gather the data, then you've got to analyze the data, and then you've got to submit it to the regulator to prove the point that you were trying to prove about the product in the first place. The key takeaway about this slide really is that when you talk about clinical research, people tend to think about points 7 and 8. It's the analysing the data and the submission of the data is what comes to mind. Or it's point 1, identifying what the study is going to be in the first place. But there's actually a whole slew of work that goes on in between those, which we tended not to think about too much, and which people tend not to realise is a regular part of clinical research. This slide brings home the same point. So the purple streams across, there's one for management of the trial as a whole, there's one around logistics, there's one around data capture, there's one around adverse events capture. That's all process stuff. That all has to have its own local storage and integration with lots of other different systems. Some of the work I've done in the past, we've been integrating anything up to 60 different systems just to be able to run a trial in one country. The data, once it's collected, goes out to analysis and then submission. So that's a completely different set of storage. And of course, there's all the resources that go into it, physical resources, that is, the subjects, the protocol, the trial plan, and so on. And at the same time, you've got clinical care going on, so a little cloud at the bottom. That's running in parallel and doing so many of the same things, but doing it through different systems. So when you take all those things, they actually just use a very familiar set of resources. So there's really only 2 resources on this drawing. There's research subject and research study that are very particular to clinical research. Things like the activity definition, plan definition, medicinal product, and so on are common to so many different processes. But the question becomes where you actually put bits of data, and the ones that have got the yellow stars on them are the ones that I'm going to dig into a little bit today, just to illustrate how these things fit together. Now, I mentioned Vulcan Connectathons earlier on. We ran 4 in January, so the 3 I mentioned before, FHIR packets, real world data, schedule of activities. We also ran the one for medication definition. So that's a whole set of additional resources that are about the identification of products. 3 of those tracks ran again in May this time. I expect that all 4 of those tracks will run in September. I suspect that all 4 of those tracks will run again in January. There will probably be some additional tracks going in there as well. But what I wanted to point out was that they're not really standalone tracks, independent, with no relationship to each other. The schedule of activities track is really the all-encompassing envelope that goes around everything, because whatever is going on, it's an activity of some sort. It fits into a plan of some sort. And when you come to look at a trial and then say, well, what else was going on at the same time? You're actually looking back at that schedule of activities and then deciding where your real world data fits within that schedule. So although the real world data can be dealt with as a standalone subject, it actually fits within that overall wrapper of schedule of activities. And in the same way, the FHIR packets project is looking at real world data from a particular viewpoint and trying to attach it to an EHR, so extend the real world data in a very particular way. And the medication definition is trying to identify things medicinal products within that real world data. So again, it fits in there. There is some overlap or spill out into other areas, but they certainly fit into the same framework. I think there are other areas, and I'm sure we will get to points where we have things that really don't fit into that pattern. But at the moment, all of what we're doing does actually fit into that bigger picture. And one of our aims is that all the work that we do across all of the tracks will build up into a coherent and an integrated set of implementation guides. So let's dig into some of the details a little bit. So R5 is a big deal for clinical research. And I know that for quite a lot of people, if you're working in the normal clinical care side of things, R5 is almost a nuisance. It's disrupting what's going on. It's providing people with something else they've got to think about, when really you'd much rather stick with R3 or R4. But if you look at the high-level view of the research study resource in its UML form in R4 and in R5 on these two slabs here, you can see that it's an awful lot of change happened between R4 and R5. The reason for that is that clinical research has tended to run somewhat behind clinical care. So when everybody else was running around developing the resources for patient and for putting things into the EHR and doing observations and all that good stuff, I will freely admit that the clinical research group, the BR&R group, was looking at it and going, well, we don't need any of that stuff. And we didn't pay attention to it as, in hindsight, we should have done. That means we're now doing a degree of catch-up. We are at a state now that the clinical care side of things was in 4 or even 5 years ago, where we're looking in detail at how we make use of resources, and people are saying, oh yes, but there isn't anywhere for me to put whatever it might be. And so we've got this level of change happening at the moment. And I want to walk through what some of those changes are and the background to them. And I think at this point, particularly if what I'm saying doesn't make sense, or if you've got questions, I'd be very happy to take them as we go along now, because it's probably easier than trying to come back to them at a later stage. So the first thing is in terms of scope. We think of clinical research as being human focused. It's regulated clinical trials. It's all the things that we've heard about as the COVID vaccines have been developed. But when you stop and think about it, there are lots of other sorts of trials that happen as well. So I have a pacemaker. That pacemaker didn't just come out of a research lab and a factory and get put in and used without going through a trial process. And some of that trial process is human focused. How well does it work? But another chunk of that is about its reliability. It's about its the environment that it's going to sit in, the extent to which it will cope with, somebody falling over and landing on that. So there is a set of trials that happen where what you've actually got is 200 pacemakers all sitting on a bench in a laboratory somewhere, and being run under some sort of simulating conditions, and there isn't a human subject as part of that process anywhere. And there really are a whole string of those sorts of things that we wanted to make provision for. So we've gone back through the definition of the both research subject and research study, and tried to ask the question, is this so focused on the human trials that it rules out that wider set of things? And of course, that's meant some changes in the structure, and moving one or two things into extensions, because they're not really something that is valid across all possible trials. The second big change that we made was with alignment with clinicaltrials.gov. So this is one of the big registries of clinical trials. Most clinical trials, not just in the US, but actually a lot of the European ones, get lodged in clinicaltrials.gov. And although we had been through and done a mapping of the fields in there, we hadn't done anything like all of them. So we've gone through, we've made sure now that we've got a really comprehensive representation of all of that clinical trial registry side of things. And in the long run, that makes for better definition of studies from a metadata perspective, and hence the ability to go and search through a set of trials and find a set of trials where the data can be reused for other purposes. At the other extreme, as I mentioned in the process drawings earlier, we tended to think a lot about either registries or the analysis of the data. We didn't think so much about the management, and we've gone through and thought more about the management, and that's in turn has added some pieces into it. And there's a general tidy up gone on. There are things that really just had been put into R4, but not put in quite in the way they should have been. So we've gone through and done that tidy up. So some specific additions. Names of studies sounds straightforward and simple. Actually, as you move from the FDA describing a product to the European Medicines Agency describing a product, they have different ways in which they like to provide multiple names. So there are short names, long names, publicly accessible names, scientific names, and there are also local names that will get used within the company as a short form. And we've been trying to fit those into the existing name and title fields, and really it's just not enough. So a label backbone element's been added that allows you to have as many different sorts of names you want. You can say what the name might actually mean. Recruitment and eligibility, we've combined into a single backbone element. We'll come and look at that in a bit more detail in a minute. But people often look at the basic resource and their first question is, well, how am I actually going to do the eligibility side of things? When trials are run, they are frequently divided up into different patterns of treatment. Those patterns of treatment are arms. The old arm structure was not really quite sufficient. It didn't have any form of identifier, so you had to do stuff on the basis of text matching. And it was very difficult to know exactly what the arm was about. So we've added some additional fields to extend that. Part of the process of moving from having trials focused purely on human clinical regulated trials to a much wider set is that we needed to move away from thinking purely about products. So not just trials where we're testing the efficacy of exotocillin at 2 different dose levels, but there are some trials where what you're trying to establish is the different management practices on some blood measure, and it's actually the blood measure that's the focus rather than the product. So we have extended that. And we also need to describe what it is that's being measured in order to come to a conclusion. Again, for some of the non-standard trials, people might be making some quite surprising measures in order to make a decision about that. It's important to be able to pick that up and find that out later. I have a real problem with status across FHIR. Every resource has a status field, and that status is actually publication status. It's about the status of that resource. Is it a draft? Is it a final version of it? Is it something that's been entered in error? And in many, many resources, that same field also gets used to describe the status of whatever thing that resource is trying to describe. And trying to get people to understand that distinction can be difficult. So we have made a separation between those two forms of status. So status date is a separate element that talks about the study itself. Has the study started? Has the study completed? Is it ongoing? What are the dates when those things happened? And we also have a distinction to be made between the state that a study is in and a milestone that it's achieved in order to go from one state to another. Not everybody needs to record that, but for some systems it's quite important. So we've also made provision for adding that distinction between a state and a milestone. And studies have lots of different groups of people working in them. We had a sponsor and a principal investigator. They're still there, but we've also added an extension so that if you've got more groups of people or organizations that are associated with a study, there's a mechanism there to record those. People come to deal with studies and represent things, and they look for the site resource because it's one of the three key things that you're dealing with. You're dealing with the study as a whole, you're dealing with the subjects that are in the study, and you're dealing with the sites where the study is actually conducted. But there isn't a site resource. And what gets used for the site resource is the research study resource. And it's not immediately obvious, but it does actually make sense. We've extended the way in which that is defined and the options that you get. And I'll come to an example in a minute that will walk through that. And then finally, two additional fields. One, so you can tie in the results. And something that's probably quite closely related is a web location for general stuff that goes with the study. So not specific documents. This is not saying, oh, there's a document that tells you about this here. This is just well, if you went to this location, you might well find some additional stuff that will be useful. So that's the changes we've made. Let's look at some examples. So the way these slides are laid out, I hope it's reasonably obvious. The black is the resource and the attributes within the resource. The red is references from one resource to another resource, but those are internal references, they're not external references. And then the blue is sample values that go into it. And where we've got coded items, I've used a hash and then whatever the code would be. And if there's nothing before the hash, then it's whatever the code system that's defined in the resource. But there are some cases where that's not the case. So how many subjects do you want in your trial? It's very easy. There's a target number attribute. You stick the number that's in there. When we look at research site or research study in its site incarnation in a minute, you'll see that that same structure can get used to say that I want 25 at this site, 70 at that site, 50 at that site, and so on. But if you think of it as the target number for whatever level this research study structure is functioning at. And then the eligibility, there is a required attribute that says whether this is to do with the group is to do with a person or something else. So this is clearly about a person. There's an attribute as to whether this is the number of people you've actually got in your group or whether it's what you would like to have. In eligibility, we're talking about what we'd like to have, so actual must be false. And then you have a series of characteristics, and the characteristics can be a range of different data types. So I've put 2 in here, gender and age. I've said that the codable concept that we're looking at here is that they're male, and any that are male we exclude. I think it's one of those fine distinctions that you might want to make as to whether you do this as you exclude the males or you do the set exclude to false and make the codable concept female. I have a sneaking suspicion that there is a little twist in there that we haven't quite worked through yet. But at the moment, it seems to me that you can do that either way around. For age, you can use the value range. You set your unit to year, which is a code of A. You set the value, the low value is 50, the high value is 65. And you set exclude to be false, so you're going to include everybody that's between 50 and 65. Hence, we have our recruitment and eligibility criteria here, which are 250 subjects, females 50 to 65. So what's going to happen to these? In the research study, the place that all the description of what needs to happen in the study is the protocol. The protocol itself is a document that gets approved by the regulator responsible for the trial. And what it says in that document is what you have got to do. And at one level, representing a schedule of activities is a simple thing to do in FHIR. There are multiple different ways in which it can be done, I think. And in one sense, that's part of the issue. Because there are multiple different ways of doing it, what we want to do is settle on one particular way of doing it and make sure that we all follow that so that we've got a degree of interoperability between the different activity definitions that we would look at. So what I'm showing here is the conclusion we've come to so far in the schedule of activities track within Vulcan. So you have your protocol attribute in research study. That refers to a plan definition. Your plan definition has a number of actions in it. Each of the actions at that level are individual visits. Each individual visit is itself another plan definition. And when you go to that plan definition, you've got, again, a series of actions within it. And those actions, in the example here, we've got recording the visit date and getting the signed consent. So 2 distinct actions. So the first block here is the same one from the slide before, recording the visit date and get the signed consent. So recording the visit date is an activity definition. So you can then go to a reference to that, which will give you chapter and verse on exactly what that is meant to be. you've got a description for it that's recording the visit date, and an observation definition that tells you what data type you've got to use for doing this and whether or not you can have multiple results. And there are a whole series of other attributes that you might well want to make use of in that. I didn't want to make these slides too complicated, but the point really to take away from these is that we're trying to build this up so we have a set of building blocks. So the observation definition here is a building block that could be used time and time and time again across multiple different trials. In the same way, the activity definition that's here could be used multiple times. So the point at which you start to assemble your blocks is when you come to your visit definition, where you think, oh, I'll have a visit date block and I'll have an informed consent block. And you can pull those in from probably a metadata repository, so a library, pull those in and actually assemble them into a full setup. And these things get much more complicated. So what's in text on the right there is the blood pressure example, which is much more complicated, where as a single activity, the subject has to lie down for 10 minutes, then you take the blood pressure, then they stand up, then you take the blood pressure again, then they stay standing for another 3 minutes, and then you take the blood pressure again. And each blood pressure, of course, has got 2 separate values to it. So you've got a much bigger and more complicated structure that you are trying to work with there. Here's the site structure we were talking about. So our research study at its very top level has got 3 other research studies that go to make it up. We go down and look at the middle research study, STE01. We've got the location is set to being USA. And location is about the geographical region you're dealing with. It's not about the GPS coordinates or the address. It's how you're dividing the world up in order to do your study. Within that USA region, there are then a series of actual sites. And the first of those sites, yes, you can say it's in Florida. You'll have to go off and invent your own codes for that. The codes that you'll find if you walk through the spec don't go down to that extent, but you can extend that code system. So you'll need to specify your coding for Florida if that's what you want to do. And then you have a location and you have an organization. And at this level, Site 0 and Site 1, those are both referring to the same, conceptually the same site. The different ways in which you're looking at it. And I think that's a slight difference from the higher level where you're actually talking about multiple different sites. And I think that's a subtlety we may need to think about a bit more. But your location, you can then give an address, and the organization can be the organization that's responsible for the trial at that location. So you'll see that the physical location of this site is Florida, but the organization that's responsible for it is actually in Texas.
Hey, Hugh, can I ask a question that came in?
Yep.
Sheridan Cook is asking, why are visits that occurred where care is delivered are recorded as a plan definition instead of an encounter, for example?
None of this is about what has happened. This is all about planning. So this is specifying in advance what you intend to do. When you've got your plan of what you intend to do, you will at a later stage have encounters. And those encounters then need to be tied back to what you plan to do in the first place. Okay. And it's that distinction between a very abstract definition of a plan, which will apply to 200 patients, and a particular care plan that would apply to one patient and the way in which that care plan then got executed.
Great, I think that's clear, thanks.
So let's go on to research subject. So the R4 versus R5, actually not quite so much difference as before. The differences were really of a similar nature, so I'm not going to go into them. I talked about them before. Let's go and look at our examples. This is the state and progress. The status of the record is it's an active record. The state for the subject, well, you've got multiple states, and this can actually tell you that screening happened my apologies, I've got a date wrong on there. So that should both be 2019 01/20 twice over. So screening happened on the 20th of January 2019. They went on to the study at that point. So from the 15th of February 2019 to the 1st of December 2020, they were actually on the study. So this is giving you a quick snapshot of what happened to that subject as they went through that trial. Subjects and patients have to be kept separate. We have a strong requirement for some trials for that anonymity. So you get this distinction between the research subject that will have a reference to a patient. I think the actual mechanics of the details in there are clear enough. The question then becomes when we go on to something like consent. So how do we work with consent? So the consent, we can see that it's for patient PAT 219. PAT 219 actually is the, both does the consenting, they're not a child. And Doc 123 is the reference document that they worked with. But when you then come back to try and tie together the consents for a research subject, the question that people have asked is, well, surely you need to actually go in and look at the patient. But if you look at this, what you need to retrieve is your research subject resource and your consent resource. They're linked by the internal link of PAT 219, but you don't actually need to go and read the record for PAT 219. That can stay anonymous, as it should do. And we have consents for a whole study. I think this is probably an area that we still need to do some more work on. And I'm conscious I'm getting close to time, so I'm going to skip forward on that to the wrap up. I hope you found it useful. We've walked through a set of resources. I've talked a little bit about Vulcan. And that's where you'll find me. Any questions, anybody?
I was still muted. Thank you so much, Hugh. That was a great presentation, very insightful. Also the changes in the new upcoming versions. There's one question that came in, and that's a question from Mike Lohmeyer on whether the FHIR API also supports rules powered by ARM rules, basically. So, for example, if one of your arms should blind patient resource data, then when I do a get on the API, does that also that data get excluded? Does that make sense? I mangled the question a bit. But...
it makes sense. I think I'd almost turn that question back to you, Ward. I think you know, because the problem with all of these sorts of questions is that you set stuff up in the resource, but the real key is the way in which you manage permissions and access in the server that you're querying. And that's almost impossible to manage just through the resource definition.
Yeah, I indeed, if you would ask me, I would think that would be the same. This, you could implement this as a system using the using the permissions, access permissions.
Yeah.
Great. I think that's all the time we have, Hugh. Thanks so much.
Thank
And if
you.
you have any more questions, feel free to put them in the chat and then you will get a notification of that. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.